January 17, 1940, northern Finland. The Karelian Isthmus. The snow falls in silence, thick and relentless, burying the pine forests in white shrouds. The temperature hovers at 40 degrees below zero. In this frozen wilderness, where the sun barely crests the horizon and darkness reigns for 18 hours each day, a different kind of soldier prepares for battle. He carries no rifle slung across his shoulder, no bayonet gleams at his hip. Instead, his hands grip the wooden handle of a standard-issue entrenching tool, a simple shovel, unremarkable in design, weighing perhaps 3 pounds. He drives it into the frozen earth with mechanical precision, each blow sending shockwaves up his arms, each strike carving out another inch of survival. This is not the war they promised him, not the glory painted on recruitment posters, not the swift mechanized campaigns that newspapers predicted would reshape Europe in a matter of weeks. This is war reduced to its most fundamental element, the desperate mathematics of dirt and depth, the ancient calculus of how much earth stands between a man and oblivion. Across the front lines of the Second World War, from the frozen tundra of the Eastern Front to the volcanic sands of Pacific, from the bocage hedgerows of Normandy to the mountain passes of Italy, millions of soldiers would come to understand a truth that no amount of training could fully prepare them for: that the shovel, not the rifle, would become their most essential tool of survival, that the ability to dig, to burrow, to excavate shelter from hostile earth would prove more valuable than marksmanship, more critical than courage, more fundamental to staying alive than any tactical doctrine taught in boot camp. The story of these soldiers, men who fought the Second World War with shovels, not guns, is a story rarely told with the weight it deserves. History remembers the tank commanders and the fighter aces, the generals who moved armies across maps and the infantry who charged into enemy fire. But beneath every advance, behind every defensive line, supporting every victory and cushioning every defeat, lay the unglamorous, exhausting, life-preserving work of excavation, the digging of foxholes and trenches, of bunkers and tunnels, of tank traps and gun emplacements, the construction of underground hospitals and ammunition dumps, of command posts buried beneath 20 feet of earth and living quarters carved into hillsides. This was the war that consumed more man-hours than any other activity, the war that broke more backs, calloused more hands, and saved more lives than any weapon ever manufactured. They came to war with expectations forged in the previous generation's mythology. The young men who enlisted in 1939 and 1940 carried in their minds images of warfare shaped by fathers and uncles who had survived the trenches of the First World War. But even those grim stories had been softened by time, edited by memory, transformed into narratives of endurance and brotherhood. The Germans who marched into Poland in September 1939 believed they were pioneering a new form of warfare, lightning war where speed and mechanization would render static defenses obsolete. The Japanese soldiers who had fought in Manchuria and China expected similar campaigns of movement and conquest. Even the British and French forces, manning the Maginot Line and preparing for conflict, imagined a war that would be fought according to established rules, with clear front lines and defined battles. The Americans, when they finally entered the conflict after Pearl Harbor, brought with them perhaps the most optimistic vision of all. They had been told they possessed superior technology, overwhelming industrial capacity, and the righteous certainty of defending democracy against tyranny. They imagined a war that would be won through firepower and logistics, through the sheer weight of material advantages. None of them, not the Germans confident in their tactical superiority, not the Japanese devoted to their code of Bushi, not the Americans trusting in their industrial might, truly understood what modern warfare would demand. None anticipated that they would spend more time with shovels in their hands than rifles, that they would dig until their palms bled, until their shoulders screamed, until the act of driving steel into earth became as automatic as breathing. The first winter of the war in Finland shattered illusions with brutal efficiency. The Soviet Red Army, having invaded on November 30, 1939, expected to overwhelm the outnumbered Finnish forces within weeks. Stalin had predicted his troops would be dining in Helsinki by Christmas. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a frozen hell where Finnish ski troops appeared like ghosts from the forest, struck with devastating precision, and vanished before Soviet forces could respond. The Red Army soldiers, many conscripted from southern regions with no experience of such climate extremes, we discovered that their tactics meant nothing when the ground refused to yield. The earth had frozen solid to a depth of several feet. Digging defensive positions required hours of labor with picks and axes before shovels could even be employed. Men attempting to construct foxholes would spend an entire day chipping away at ice-hard soil, only to excavate a depression barely deep enough to shelter a prone body. Soviet military doctrine emphasized aggressive offensive operations. Their training had focused on advancing, on attacking, on overwhelming enemy positions through superior numbers. But in Finland, in that terrible winter, survival meant going to ground. It meant finding or creating shelter from temperatures that could kill an exposed man in minutes. And the frozen earth fought them every step of the way. Reports from Soviet field commanders during the Winter War reveal a force in crisis. One division commander wrote in his diary, "Discovered after the war, we lose more men to the cold than to Finnish bullets. Those who cannot dig die. It is that simple. The ground is iron, our shovels break, our men break." Medical records from Soviet field hospitals documented thousands of cases of severe frostbite, many requiring amputation. The majority of these casualties occurred among soldiers who lacked adequate sheltermen who could not dig deep enough, fast enough, to escape the killing cold. The Finnish forces, outnumbered and outgunned, survived through superior fuel. They understood the terrain. They knew how to use snow for concealment and insulation. They dug their positions in the autumn, before the deep freeze, creating networks of bunkers and firing positions that allowed small units to hold off vastly larger Soviet formations, while Red Army soldiers struggled to chip shallow scrapes in frozen ground. Finnish troops fought from prepared positions with overhead cover, with floors lined with pine boughs for insulation, with carefully constructed fields of fire. The lesson was stark. In modern warfare, the side that could dig faster and dig better held an almost insurmountable advantage. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, launching Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht brought with them the confidence earned in 2 years of nearly unbroken victories. They had crushed Poland, conquered France, overrun the Balkans. German tactical doctrine emphasized rapid movement, combined arms coordination, the aggressive exploitation of breakthroughs. They were the masters of mobile warfare, and they expected to defeat the Soviet Union before winter. But the vastness of Russia consumed their momentum. As summer turned to autumn, as the roads dissolved into bottomless mud, as the first snow began to fall, German soldiers discovered what the Red Army had learned in Finland, that survival in Russia meant digging. The German term Erdloch, earthhole, became one of the most common words in letters sent home from the Eastern Front every evening. As units halted their advance, the frantic work of excavation began. Each soldier was expected to dig his own foxhole before darkness fell, regardless of exhaustion, regardless of how many miles had been marched that day. The shovel, which many troops had initially discarded to save weight, became precious equipment. Units that had thrown away their entrenching tools paid in blood when Soviet counterattacks caught them in the open. A German infantry officer, writing in late October 1941 as his unit approached Moscow, described the nightly ritual. "We are machines for digging." Each evening the same desperate race against darkness and cold. Dig deep enough and you might survive the night. Dig deep enough and you might survive the artillery barrage that will surely come with dawn. The soil here is different than in France or Poland, harder, more clay, freezing rapidly as temperature drops. We dig in shifts, 2 men to each hole, one digging while the other rests. But there is no rest. There is only digging and the fear of not digging deep enough. When the Soviet winter offensive began in December 1941, driving back the German forces from the gates of Moscow, the Wehrmacht learned another harsh lesson about earth and survival. In retreat, lacking prepared defensive positions, German units suffered catastrophic losses. Men caught in the open during Soviet attacks had no cover, no shelter from artillery, no protection from the elements. Casualty reports from this period make for grim reading. Entire companies lost not to enemy action but to exposure, to frostbite, to the simple fact that they could not dig into frozen ground fast enough to survive the Red Army. Defending their homeland, fought from positions prepared over months. They had dug deep bunkers, underground command posts, interconnected trench systems that allowed movement without exposure. Soviet doctrine had been reformed after the Finnish disaster. Now every unit carried adequate entrenching tools. Every soldier received training in the construction of field fortifications. They dug with a desperation born of knowing the alternative, and they dug with the knowledge that the earth itself was their most reliable ally. By 1942, the Eastern Front had become a landscape of excavation. Every village, every hill, every crossroads was fortified with layers of trenches, bunkers, firing positions. Both sides committed thousands of men to the construction of defensive works. The scale of these fortifications dwarfed anything seen in the First World War. Hitler's Atlantic Wall would receive enormous publicity, but the true monuments to military excavation were being built in Russia and Ukraine, where millions of cubic meters of earth were moved by human labor. The Battle of Stalingrad represented the culmination of this excavating war. In the rubble of that destroyed city, conventional warfare became impossible. Tanks could not maneuver through streets choked with debris. Artillery could not easily target enemies hidden in cellars and sewers. The battle devolved into a savage contest for individual buildings, individual rooms, individual piles of rubble. And in this chaotic environment, the ability to dig to tunnel through walls, to excavate firing positions in debris, to create shelter beneath collapsed structures became the defining skill. German and Soviet soldiers in Stalingrad dug through apartment floors to create vertical fighting positions. They tunneled through basements to move between buildings without exposing themselves to snipers. They excavated bunkers in the ruins, roofed with steel beams scavenged from factories, insulated with furniture and carpets pulled from destroyed homes. One Soviet report from the fighting in the Barakadi factory district noted that an entire company had survived. 2 weeks of combat while living entirely underground, emerging only to fight, returning to their subterranean warren to eat and sleep and treat their wounded. A German soldier's letter, intercepted by Soviet intelligence in December 1942, described the surreal existence. "We live like rats in the walls. I have not seen the sky except through holes and debris for 6 days. We dig with shovels, with our hands, with pieces of metal. We dig because not digging means death. The Russians dig too. Sometimes we can hear them on the other side of a wall, excavating just as frantically as we are. The war has gone underground. The war has become about who can burrow deeper." The war in the Pacific presented its own peculiar demands for excavation. The Japanese forces, expanding across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands with stunning speed in early 1942, brought with them a military philosophy that emphasized offense over defense, attack over entrenchment. The warrior code of Bushido glorified aggressive action, sacrifice, the willingness to charge enemy positions regardless of casualties. Digging defensive fortifications seemed almost antithetical to this ethos. But as American forces began their island-hopping campaign, as the tide of war turned against Japan, Japanese commanders made a crucial adaptation. They began to dig, and they dug with an intensity and sophistication that would shock American troops and military planners alike. The volcanic rock and coral of Pacific Islands presented unique challenges for excavation. On atolls like Tarawa and Pelaleo, the ground consisted of coral limestone, nearly as hard as concrete, impervious to standard entrenching tools. Japanese engineers solved this problem through brutal, labor-intensive methods. They used explosives to fracture the coral, then cleared the debris by hand. They've worked for months, sometimes years, transforming islands into fortresses. On Iwo, Japanese forces commanded by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi spent 8 months preparing defensive positions before American forces invaded in February 1945. They excavated an underground network of extraordinary complexity, 11 miles of tunnels, connecting bunkers and artillery positions, command posts and field hospitals, ammunition storage and living quarters. Some of these tunnels descended 5 levels deep into the volcanic rock. They were equipped with ventilation systems, with multiple entrances and exits, with reinforced ceilings capable of withstanding direct hits from naval bombardment. American Marines landing on Iwo Jima's black sand beaches expected to face fortified positions. They had no conception of the scale of Japanese preparations. The island, only 8 square miles in area, had been transformed into a 3-dimensional battlefield. Japanese soldiers could move through the tunnel system to appear suddenly behind American lines, attack, and vanish underground before retaliation was possible. Artillery pieces were mounted on rails inside caves, rolled out to fire, then pulled back into the mountain before counter-battery fire could find them. The battle for Iwo Jima became a battle of excavation versus firepower. American forces brought overwhelming superiority in naval guns, aircraft, tanks, and artillery. They pulverized the island's surface with thousands of tons of high explosives. But the Japanese defenders, buried deep, survived. Marines discovered that taking the island meant physically excavating the enemy from the earth, using flamethrowers and explosives to clear each bunker, each cave, each tunnel entrance. One Marine Corps after-action report noted the Japanese had become invisible. "We could be standing on top of a bunker containing 50 enemy soldiers and not know it." They had dug themselves into the island so thoroughly that conventional tactics were useless. We had to become diggers ourselves, had to go underground to fight them. And so American troops dug. They dug foxholes in volcanic ash that collapsed as fast as it could be excavated. They dug approach trenches toward Japanese positions, working at night, trying to gain yards of ground while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. Combat engineers dug beneath Japanese bunkers to plant explosive charges. The 133rd Naval Construction Battalion Subis arrived on Iwo Jima while fighting still raged and began excavating an airfield, working under artillery fire, digging and grading and compacting earth while Marines fought and died, hundreds of yards away. The pattern repeated across the Pacific. On Okinawa, the last major battle of the war, Japanese forces constructed the Lifeline, a defensive system of layered fortifications that utilized natural caves. Augmented with months of digging and tunneling, American forces required 82 days to break through these defenses, suffering over 50,000 casualties in the process. The battle became a slow, grinding advance measured in yards per day, with flamethrowers and explosives used to clear each defensive position. A soldier from the 96th Infantry Division wrote home in May 1945, "We're fighting an enemy we can't see. They're underground, in caves, in tunnels. Every hill is hollow. We take a position and they appear behind us because they have tunnels leading to our rear. The only way to win is to bury them in their holes. So we dig and we blast and we burn, trying to collapse their tunnels, seal their caves. It's not warfare as I understood it. It's extermination work, and it requires shovels as much as rifles." The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, represented the largest amphibious assault in history. The planning for D-Day consumed years of effort. involved millions of personnel, required the coordination of thousands of ships and aircraft. But beneath the dramatic narrative of the beach landings, beneath the stories of paratroopers and rangers and infantry struggling ashore under withering fire, lay another story, the story of military engineering and mass excavation that made the invasion possible. Months before the first Allied soldiers set foot on French soil, engineers were digging in England. They excavated supply dumps across southern England, vast pits filled with ammunition, fuel, rations, medical supplies, everything an army would need to fight across France. They dug drainage systems for the camps housing hundreds of thousands of troops. They constructed underground fuel storage tanks, excavated hard stands for aircraft, dug foundations for hospitals and maintenance facilities. The scale of this preparatory excavation was staggering. The United States Army's historical records indicate that in the 18 months prior to D, engineer battalions in Britain moved over 50 million cubic yards of earth, enough to dig a trench 10 feet deep and 10 feet wide from London to Moscow. Most of this work was done by hand, with shovels, because mechanical equipment was needed elsewhere, was being stockpiled for the invasion itself on the beaches of Normandy. As infantry pinned down by German defensive fire struggled to advance off the sand, combat engineers went to work with the one tool that could save the invasion: the bulldozer, essentially a mechanized shovel. They used these machines to clear beach obstacles, to push aside debris, to excavate paths through sand dunes and sea walls. Without these engineers, without their ability to literally reshape the landscape under fire, the invasion might have failed at the water's edge. But the bulldozers were supplemented by thousands of men with hand tools. Engineers dug under fire to plant explosive charges that would blast gaps in German obstacles. They excavated hasty roads through sand, using shovels to fill craters and level tracks for vehicles. They dug graves for the fallen because the dead could not be left on the beaches where more waves of troops would land. A combat engineer with the 5th Engineer Special Brigade described the scene on Omaha Beach. The noise was incredibly loud. Machine guns, naval guns firing over our heads. But we had a job to do. We had to clear lanes through the obstacles, had to dig paths through the shingle, had to get the vehicles moving off the beach. So we dug. Men were dying around us and we dug. It was mechanical. You didn't think about it. You put your shovel in the sand and you moved earth because that's what would keep more men from dying. Once Allied forces broke out from the beaches, the war in France became a different kind of digging campaign. In the hedgerow country of the Bocage, where every field was surrounded by earthen banks topped with dense vegetation, combat became a slow, grinding advance from one hedgerow to the next. These earthen barriers, some of them centuries old, were perfect defensive positions. German forces used them to establish killing zones, with machine guns and mortar positioned to cover every approach. American troops learned to dig parallel to the hedgerows, excavating approach trenches that allowed movement without exposure. Combat engineers developed specialized equipment, plows and charges designed to blast through the earthen banks. But much of the work remained manual. Men with shovels digging saps toward German positions, advancing a few feet each night under cover of darkness. The exhaustion was cumulative and crushing. Infantry units expected to march during the day, fight when they encountered German resistance, then dig defensive positions at night. Every single night, regardless of exhaustion. The order was the same: dig in, because if German artillery or a counterattack came at dawn, the men in holes would survive and those caught in the open would die. A lieutenant with the 29th Infantry Division wrote in August 1944, "I have not slept above ground in 6 weeks. Every evening we dig new holes because we've advanced during the day. The men are so tired they can barely lift their shovels, but they dig because they know the cost of not digging. I've learned to sleep sitting up in a foxhole. I've learned to judge soil by fill clay versus sand, rocky versus lowland, to predict how long excavation will take. These are not skills they taught at West Point. These are the skills that keep you alive." In the midst of this global war of excavation, the simple entrenching tool became laden with symbolism and meaning beyond its practical utility. Soldiers developed personal relationships with their shovels, naming them, modifying them, treating them with the care usually reserved for weapons. A rifle might jam or break, but a shovel, properly maintained, was nearly indestructible. It represented certainty in an uncertain world, the certainty that if you could dig, you could survive another day. Different armies issued different designs of entrenching tools, and soldiers quickly developed strong preferences. The German army's entrenching spade was compact and efficient, designed to be carried on the belt without interfering with movement. Soviet shovels were larger, cruder, but remarkably effective in hard soil. The American M1943 entrenching tool could be folded for compact storage. Though soldiers complained, the hinge mechanism was prone to failure. These small differences took on outsized importance. Soldiers who captured enemy entrenching tools often kept them, preferring them to their own issued equipment. A Soviet soldier might carry a German spade because it was lighter. An American GI might prize a captured Japanese tool for its superior handle design. The shovel became a form of universal currency. something that transcended national boundaries because its purpose was understood by every soldier, regardless of language or allegiance. But more than this, the shovel represented a fundamental truth about the nature of modern industrial warfare. No matter how advanced the technology, no matter how powerful the weapons, survival still depended on the most ancient of human survival strategies: seeking shelter in the earth. The soldier with a rifle was dangerous. The soldier with a machine gun was deadly, but the soldier with a shovel and a time to use it was nearly impossible to kill. This lesson was taught and retaught across every theater of the war. German forces that failed to dig adequate defenses in North Africa were destroyed by Allied artillery and air power. Japanese garrisons that attempted to defend Pacific Islands with surface fortifications were annihilated by naval bombardment. Soviet units caught in the open during German advances were encircled and captured by the thousands, but forces that had dug deep, that had created layered defensive positions, that had burrowed into the earth these forces could hold. Against overwhelming odds, the Battle of Monte Cassino in Italy demonstrated this principle with bloody clarity. German paratroopers ordered to defend the monastery and the surrounding mountains spent months digging positions into solid rock. They used jackhammers, explosives, hand tools, whatever was necessary to carve bunkers into the mountainside. When Allied forces attacked in early 1944, they brought massive firepower, hundreds of bombers reducing the monastery to rubble, thousands of artillery pieces pounding German positions for weeks. But the German defenders, deep in their excavated positions, survived, and they held. 4 separate Allied offensives failed to dislodge them. The battle consumed for months and cost the Allies over 55,000 casualties. Not until a 5th offensive, combining overwhelming force with tactical ingenuity, did Allied troops finally break through. And even then, the German withdrawal was orderly, accomplished by troops who had survived months of bombardment because they had dug deeply enough, thoroughly enough, expertly enough. A British soldier who fought at Cassino wrote afterward, "We thought we had destroyed them. We bombed them, shelled them, attacked them with every weapon we possessed, but they were underground. They had dug so deep that nothing could reach them. It was like fighting phantoms. They would appear, fight, disappear, back into the earth." I developed a profound respect for German military engineering and a profound hatred of mountains and shovels. When American forces arrived in Europe and the Pacific in large numbers, they brought with them not just industrial might, but a distinctly American approach to military engineering. The United States Army was, in many ways, an army built on engineering principles. American society in the 1940s was undergoing rapid industrialization and mechanization. The generation of young men drafted into service had grown up during the New Deal, many having worked in the Civilian Conservation Corps, building roads and dams and parks. They were comfortable with tools, with construction, with the transformation of landscapes. This background manifested in American military doctrine that emphasized engineering support to an unprecedented degree. Every infantry division included an engineer battalion. Every corps and army had additional engineer regiments attached. These units were equipped not just with hand tools but with bulldozers, graders, cranes, power shovels, portable sawmills, cement mixers, and entire industrial infrastructure made mobile. The American talent for mechanized excavation became most evident in the rapid construction of airfields. In the Pacific, CB battalions could land on a captured island and carve a functional airstrip out of jungle or volcanic rock in a matter of days. They worked around the clock, using bulldozers and scrapers to move thousands of cubic yards of earth per hour. What might have taken thousands of men weeks to accomplish with hand tools, American engineers completed in 72 hours with machines. This capacity for rapid engineering created strategic advantages. American forces could advance, consolidate positions, build infrastructure, and be resupplying and reinforcing before enemy forces could organize effective counterattacks. The speed of American excavation and construction compressed the operational timeline, keeping enemies off balance. But American soldiers still dug by hand, extensively and continuously. The mechanized equipment supported large-scale projects, airfields, bridges. The individual infantryman's survival still depended on his entrenching tool and his willingness to use it. And here, American forces had to learn lessons that European armies had already absorbed through painful experience. Early American engagements in North Africa and Italy revealed deficiencies in field fortification practices. Units took unnecessary casualties because soldiers failed to dig adequate positions, or dug them too slowly, or constructed them incorrectly. The problem was not lack of tools but lack of understanding about how critical proper excavation technique was to survival. The Army responded with intensive training. Manuals were updated and expanded. Training camps in the United States incorporated realistic field exercises where troops practiced digging under simulated combat conditions. Veterans rotated back from combat zones to training units, bringing hard-earned knowledge about foxhole construction, drainage, overhead cover, camouflage. One instructional manual from 1944 stated, "The entrenching tool is as important as your rifle. Skill in its use will save your life more certainly than marksmanship. A foxhole properly constructed provides protection from artillery fragments, small arms fire, and aerial bombardment. The soldier who can dig a proper foxhole in 20 minutes has a survival advantage over the soldier who takes an hour. This emphasis on excavation as a survival, with skill rather than mere manual labor, represented a conceptual shift. Digging was not punishment, duty, or time-wasting activity. It was a combat essential, as fundamental to soldiering as shooting or marching. Units began to take pride in their fortifications to compete in speed and quality of excavation. By late 1944, American infantry units in Europe and the Pacific had become expert diggers. They could assess terrain quickly, select optimal positions, excavate effective fortifications with impressive speed. They understood drainage, how to dig trenches that wouldn't flood in rain. They knew how to construct overhead cover that would stop shell fragments without requiring scarce materials. They learned to dig positions that allowed interlocking fields of fire, that provided concealed routes of movement, that could be defended by minimal forces. A sergeant with the 4th Infantry Division, writing from Germany in March 1945, described his squad's nightly routine. "We've got it down to a science now. When we stop, everyone knows their job. 2 men secure the perimeter while the others dig, where you can have 6 fighting positions excavated and linked by communication trenches in under an hour. The new replacements watch us and think we're obsessed. Then the first artillery barrage comes in, and they understand. They become believers, and then they become diggers." While American forces were learning the value of proper field fortifications, the Eastern Front had evolved into a landscape that represented the ultimate expression of excavation warfare. By 1943, both German and Soviet forces had been digging for 2 years continuously. The front lines were no longer mere trenches but elaborate underground complexes that housed entire divisions. The Germans, forced onto the defensive after Stalingrad and the failure of the Kursk offensive, constructed defensive lines that attempted to utilize every lesson learned in the First World War. The Panther Line, the Waton Line, the East Wall. These were not simple trench systems but layered defensive zones extending 30 miles in depth. They incorporated concrete bunkers, anti-tank ditches, minefields, wire obstacles, and connecting trenches deep enough to allow troops to move safely while standing upright. The construction of these defenses required slave labor on a horrific scale. The SS forced concentration camp prisoners, Soviet posay, and impressed civilians to dig for the Hundreds of thousands of people were worked to death excavating defensive positions that German forces would abandon. Within months, as the Soviet advance continued, the earthworks remained visible in satellite photographs. Today's scars across the landscape testifying to this massive, futile effort. The Soviet forces attacking these positions to develop their own excavation techniques. Their artillery tactics emphasized systematic destruction of German fortifications through overwhelming bombardment, but they also dug extensively, constructing approach trenches that allowed infantry to advance toward German lines while protected from fire. These saps would be extended forward during the night, yards at a time, with the dirt thrown up as a parapet facing the enemy. Soviet combat engineers became experts in rapid excavation under fire. They developed techniques for breaching German defensive lines that combined explosives with hand digging. Assault teams would advance during artillery barrages, using the noise and confusion to approach German positions, then dig beneath bunkers to plant explosive charges. It was dangerous, exhausting work with casualty rates approaching 50%, but it was effective. One Soviet memoir, published after the war, described the experience. "We were the ground's soldiers. We lived in it, fought in it, died in it. The earth was both enemy and protector. In winter, the frozen ground was hard as steel, unbreakable, and we would chip at it for hours to create the smallest shelter. In spring, the mud was bottomless, and our trenches would collapse, burying men alive. In summer, the dust would choke us as we dug, and in autumn, the rain would turn our excavations into rivers. But we dug because not digging was death. We dug because the German machine guns waited above ground, and only below ground could we advance." The Battle of Berlin in 1945 represented the final evolution of this underground warfare. The city became a three-dimensional battlefield where combat raged simultaneously at street level, in buildings, in the subway tunnels, and in the bunkers beneath government buildings. Hitler's Fall bunker, buried beneath the Reich, was only the most famous of thousands of underground facilities that had been excavated throughout the city. Soviet forces advancing into Berlin had to clear the city block by block, building by building, room by room, bunker by bunker. They used flamethrowers and explosives to clear defensive positions, but they also used shovels extensively digging through rubble, excavating paths through collapsed buildings, tunneling through basements to bypass German strongpoints. The symbolic power of Soviet soldiers planting their flag atop the Reichstag is well known. Less remembered is that those same soldiers had fought their way up from below, through cellars and sewers, emerging from underground to storm the building. The war had literally been fought from beneath the earth to the heights of Nazi power. When the war ended in 1945, the accounting began. Historians tallied the battles won and lost, the casualties suffered, the material expended. The numbers were staggering, perhaps 60 million dead, entire cities destroyed, national borders redrawn. But one category of statistic rarely appears in histories of the war: the total amount of earth moved by human labor. There is no precise figure, no carefully calculated cubic yardage, but fragmentary records suggest the scale. The Soviet Union alone dug approximately 250,000 miles of trenches during the war, enough to circle the earth 10 times. German defensive lines in France, Belgium, and Italy added thousands more miles. The Pacific Islands, transformed by Japanese and American engineers, represented millions of cubic yards of excavation. If we include not just frontline fortifications but also the supply dumps, the airfields, the training facilities, the mass graves, the construction sites for bunkers and facilities, the total earth moved during World War II likely exceeded that moved during any previous period in human history, including the construction of the Egyptian pyramids or the Panama Canal. All of this excavation, or at least a very substantial portion, was accomplished by human labor, by soldiers with shovels, working until their hands bled, until their backs spasmed, until the act of lifting another shovelful of dirt seemed impossible, and then lifting one more, because the alternative was death. The shovel never received its proper recognition in the histories of the war. No medals were awarded for exceptional digging. No monuments were erected to the common soldier with his entrenching tool. The men who survived because they could dig well and dig quickly received no special commendations. Their skill saved their lives and the lives of their comrades, but it was considered too mundane for official recognition. Yet the veterans knew, in memoirs and letters, in unit histories and personal accounts, soldiers from every nation paid tribute to their entrenching tools. They wrote about the calluses, the blisters that became scars, the permanent changes to their hands from thousands of hours gripping wooden handles. They described the satisfaction of a well-dug foxhole, the security of proper overhead cover, the relief of having successfully excavated a position before enemy fire began. An American veteran, interviewed in the 1980s about his service in Europe, was asked what he remembered most vividly about the war. He replied, "The smell of fresh-turned earth. We dug constantly. In France, Belgium, Germany, always digging. Different soils in different places, different smells, but always the same action, the same necessary work. I can still feel the weight of that shovel in my hands. Sometimes I dream about digging, and I wake up exhausted as if I'd really been doing it all night." The war taught me that survival is simple. Put enough earth between you and danger. Everything else is details. The Second World War was fought with the most advanced military technology yet developed by human civilization. Radar and sonar, jet aircraft and ballistic missiles, atomic weapons and proximity fuses. The pace of technological innovation during the war years was breathtaking. Nations poured billions of dollars and the talents of their greatest scientists into developing new ways to kill more efficiently, to destroy more completely, to gain technological advantage over enemies. And yet, despite all this innovation, despite all this technological sophistication, soldiers survived by employing the most ancient defensive technique known to humanity: digging holes in the ground. The fundamental tools of survival in World War II: a shovel to pick. The human body capable of moving earth would have been completely recognizable to a Roman legionary or a medieval man-at-arms. This paradox reveals something essential about the nature of industrial warfare. Technology increases the lethality of weapons, the range at which death can be delivered, the scale of destruction that can be unleashed, but it does not change the basic human vulnerability to explosive force and flying metal. A soldier in 1944, facing artillery fire, was no less fragile than his grandfather had been in 1914. The weapons had improved. The defenses remained the same. Earth as much of it as possible. Between flesh and shrapnel. The lesson should have been learned after the First World War. After 4 years of trench warfare demonstrated beyond any doubt that troops in prepared positions could hold against vastly superior forces. But the interwar period had been dominated by theories emphasizing mobility and offense. Military theorists had convinced themselves that new technologies, tanks, aircraft, mechanized infantry, had made static defense obsolete. They were wrong. Static defense had not become obsolete. It had merely been waiting for the next war to reassert its relevance. And so millions of soldiers relearned what their fathers had known: that the shovel was as essential as the rifle, that the ability to dig was as important as the ability to shoot. They relearned these lessons at terrible cost, through casualties that might have been prevented if the knowledge had been properly retained and transmitted. The men who fought World War II with shovels were not separate from those who fought with guns. They were the same men, doing different work depending on circumstances. Every infantryman was both a shooter and a digger, both an attacker and an excavator. The duality was inescapable. To advance meant to dig new positions. To defend meant to dig deeper ones. To survive meant to dig constantly. Decades after the war ended, the evidence of all this digging remains. The French countryside still bears the scars of fortifications from 1944. Farmers plowing fields in Normandy still occasionally uncover collapsed foxholes and buried equipment. The forests of Belgium and Germany contain crater fields from artillery barrages, the ground still disturbed 80 years later. The Pacific Islands tell similar stories. On Iwo Jima now returned to Japanese control. Many of the tunnels excavated by General Kuribayashi's forces remain intact. They are too deep, too extensive, to have been fully destroyed. Tourists can visit portions of the underground network, walking through passages carved by Japanese engineers and laborers who knew they were digging their own tombs. In Russia, the scale of remaining earthworks is almost incomprehensible. Anti-tank ditches, trench lines, bunker complexes, these features cover thousands of square miles. Some have been preserved as memorials, but most simply remain too extensive to be removed, gradually eroding but still visible from aircraft. These scars in the earth are monuments, more permanent than marble or bronze. They testify to the scale of effort, the enormity of labor, the desperate importance of excavation during the war. They are archaeological sites documenting a particular form of human activity, the military excavation, the combat earthwork, the fortification dug under fire. Future archaeologists, if human civilization were somehow to collapse and leave these sites unrecorded, might reasonably conclude that some planet-wide construction project had taken place during the 1940s. The sheer volume of deliberate earth movement during that period, the global distribution of trenches and bunkers and fortifications, would suggest coordinated effort on an almost unimaginable scale, and in a sense, they would be correct. The Second World War was a coordinated global effort, but not one of construction for beneficial purposes. It was the largest, most destructive mobilization of human labor and resources in history, and a substantial portion of that effort went into digging into the desperate, exhausting, essential work of excavating survival from hostile Earth. The shovel in World War II came to represent more than just a tool. It became a symbol of the gap between military rhetoric and military reality. Propaganda posters showed heroic soldiers charging with fixed bayonets, pilots in aerial combat, tank commanders leading armored spearheads. None of them showed the unglamorous truth that most soldiers spent more time digging than fighting, that the shovel saw more use than the rifle. This gap between representation and reality created a psychological burden for veterans. They had imagined themselves as warriors, as fighters, as heroes, but the bulk of their experience was labor-hard, physical, unglamorous labor. The act of digging, while essential to survival, did not fit comfortable narratives of martial valor. There was no glory in excavating a latrine, no honor in the 1,000th foxhole dug in frozen ground. Yet soldiers developed their own understanding of dignity in this work. They recognized that a well-constructed fortification was a form of craftsmanship, that the ability to read terrain and select optimal positions required skill and experience, that keeping your unit alive through proper preparation was as valuable as any tactical brilliance. The men who could dig quickly and dig well were valued, were essential to unit survival, even if their contribution would never be celebrated in official histories. This understanding that unglamorous, necessary work was as important as heroic action represents one of the war's more profound lessons. Modern warfare, industrial warfare, total warfare could not be won by heroes alone. It required millions of ordinary men performing ordinary tasks with discipline and skill. Digging was perhaps the most ordinary of these tasks, and therefore the most representative of how wars are actually fought and won. The men who fought World War II with shovels understood something that civilians and later generations would find difficult to grasp, that war is mostly boring, repetitive, exhausting work punctuated by moments of terror. The digging was the boring part, the repetitive part, the exhausting part, but it was also the part that kept you alive during the terrifying parts. A Canadian soldier, writing to his family after returning from Europe, tried to explain, "When people ask me about the war, they want to hear about battles and danger. They want war stories. But my war was mostly digging. We dug in England, we dug in France, we dug in Belgium, we dug in Holland, we dug in Germany. We dug when we were tired, when it was raining, when the ground was frozen, when we could barely stand from exhaustion. We dug because digging was the difference between living and dying. That was my war. It wasn't glorious, but it was real, and I came home because I learned to dig well." The physical cost of all this digging is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Soldiers developed chronic back problems from the repetitive stress of excavation. They suffered permanent hand injuries from blisters that became infected, from tools that slipped and caused deep cuts. They developed respiratory problems from breathing dust or working in poorly ventilated, underground spaces. These injuries were not classified as combat wounds. They did not qualify for Purple Hearts or medical discharges, but they were casualties of war nonetheless. The price paid for survival through excavation. Many veterans carried these injuries for the rest of their lives: chronic pain that doctors could not fully treat, limitations of mobility that prevented them from returning to pre-war occupations, and beyond the physical injuries, there was exhaustion. The cumulative exhaustion of months or years of continuous digging, the psychological weight of knowing that every day, regardless of how tired you were, Regardless of what else happened, you would have to dig again. That there would be no relief, no day off from excavation, until the war ended. This exhaustion broke men as surely as combat trauma. Medical records from all combatant nations document thousands of cases of psychological breakdown attributed to simple exhaustion, not from battle stress or fear, but from the unrelenting physical demands of military service. Many of these men had reached their breaking point while digging, while performing one more repetition of a task they could no longer bear to contemplate. A U.S. Army psychiatrist, writing after the war about combat exhaustion, noted the human body and mind have limits. We can endure fear, danger, discomfort for extended periods, but we cannot endure unrelenting physical labor without adequate rest indefinitely. Many of the exhaustion cases I treated had not been broken by combat but by the endless routine of military life: the digging, the marching, the carrying of loads, the constant physical demands with inadequate sleep and nutrition. These men simply had nothing left to give. They had reached the absolute limit of their endurance. The fact that such breakdowns were common, and commonly documented, suggests that the physical demands of World War II, of which digging was a major component, pushed human endurance beyond sustainable limits. The war demanded more than many men could give, and they gave it anyway, and it destroyed them in ways that left no visible wounds. One peculiar equality existed in the armies of World War II. Every soldier, regardless of rank or background, was expected to dig. Generals might plan operations from headquarters, but junior officers dug alongside their men. Soldiers from privileged backgrounds found themselves doing manual labor they had never imagined performing. The war was, in this sense, democratizing. This was particularly striking in the American and British forces, where class distinctions in civilian life remained significant. Young men from upper-class families who had never performed physical labor found themselves issued shovels in order to dig. The experience was often shocking, occasionally transformative. Some adapted, learning to value the competence and skill of working-class soldiers, who knew how to handle tools and judge the quality of their work. Others struggled, their lack of practical experience rendering them less effective than men from farm or industrial backgrounds. The Soviet Red Army took a different approach. Manual labor was ideologically valorized in communist society. The worker and peasant were celebrated in propaganda. There was no shame in digging because digging was workers' labor, and workers were the foundation of the state. Soviet soldiers were often better prepared psychologically for the physical demands of excavation because they came from a society that honored such work. The German army maintained more rigid class distinctions, but even there, the realities of combat forced a degree of equality. An officer might have Batman to prepare his meals and maintain his equipment, but he still dug his own foxhole. The machine gun was no respecter of rank, and neither was the need for cover. This enforced equality. This requirement that all men dig created bonds across social boundaries. Shared labor, shared exhaustion, shared understanding of the importance of proper excavation created solidarity. Men learned to judge each other not by pre-war status but by competence and reliability. A soldier who dug well, who helped others when they struggled, who took his share of the necessary work without complaint, this was a man to be valued, regardless of his civilian background. While infantry dug for survival, combat engineers dug as their primary mission. These specialists, the engineers, sappers, pioneers, Seabees, were the true professionals of excavation warfare. They possessed technical knowledge about soil mechanics, drainage, structural integrity. They understood how to read landscapes, to identify optimal defensive positions, to assess the effort required for various engineering tasks. Combat engineers performed some of the war's most dangerous work. They cleared minefields by crawling forward and probing the ground with bayonets, excavating each mine by hand. They built bridges under fire, often working in water, always exposed to enemy observation and artillery. They demolished enemy fortifications by approaching close enough to place explosive charges. Their casualty rates were consistently among the highest of any branch of service, but they also performed essential work that made everything else possible. Engineers built the roads that allowed armies to advance. They constructed the bridges that permitted rivers to be crossed. They excavated the supply dumps where ammunition and fuel were stored. They dug the wells that provided water. They built the airfields from which aircraft operated. Without engineers, modern armies would have been paralyzed. The scale and complexity of World War II military operations required engineering support at every level, and much of that support involved excavation, moving earth, shaping terrain, creating infrastructure from raw landscape. An engineer officer with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers reflected after the war, "We built a temporary civilization across France and Germany. We dug, paved, bridged, and constructed the entire infrastructure needed to support an army of millions. Every gallon of fuel required storage facilities, huge excavations lined with protective berms. Every field hospital required foundations and drainage. Every airfield required thousands of cubic yards of earth moved and compacted. We were as much construction workers as soldiers, and our contribution was absolutely essential even though it receives little recognition." This recognition gap, the failure to adequately acknowledged the contribution of engineers and the importance of excavation work, generally reflects broader societal attitudes about manual labor versus combat. Societies tend to valorize direct combat action, while taking for granted the logistical and engineering support that makes such action possible. But any serious examination of World War II reveals that engineering, excavation and construction were not supporting activities but central ones. The war could not have been fought, much less won, without them. Veterans' relationships with their wartime experiences were complex and varied, but many maintained particular feelings about their entrenching tools. Some veterans kept their shovels after the war, bringing them home as souvenirs. These tools occupied strange positions in post-war households, too mundane to be displayed prominently like medals or uniforms, too meaningful to be discarded or relegated to garage use. One veteran's son, interviewed for an oral history project, described his father's shovel. "It hung on a nail in the basement for my entire childhood. I asked about it once. My father said it saved his life more times than his rifle did. That was all he said. He never told war stories, never talked about combat, but he kept that shovel, and he'd take it down occasionally and sharpen the edge, even though he never used it. It meant something to him that he couldn't or wouldn't articulate." This inability to articulate the significance is itself significant. The shovel represented survival, but survival obtained through exhausting, unglamorous labor. It represented the gap between how soldiers imagined war would be and how it actually was. It represented lost youth, permanently damaged bodies, exhaustion that became chronic fatigue lasting decades. These are not comfortable memories to examine or explain. Yet the veterans who kept their shovels, who maintained them, who occasionally would run their hands along wooden handles worn smooth by desperate use, these men were honoring something important. They were acknowledging that survival came not through heroics but through preparation, that the simple tools and basic skills saved lives more reliably than courage or luck, that the ability to dig to excavate safety from hostile earth was the most fundamental military skill of all. In the end, the story of soldiers who fought World War II with shovels is the story of the war itself. Stripped of propaganda and romance, it is the story of ordinary men performing extraordinary labor under terrible conditions because the alternative was death. It is the story of how modern industrial warfare, for all its technological sophistication, still came down to ancient fundamentals: earth and blood, exhaustion and endurance. The desperate mathematics of how much dirt stands between life and oblivion. These soldiers, these diggers, these excavators, these men who measured their survival in cubic yards of displaced earth won no special recognition. They appear in no dramatic photographs. Their names are not remembered like those of Medal of Honor recipients or famous commanders. But they were the war's essential workers, the men whose labor made everything else possible, whose skill kept themselves and their comrades alive. They dug in France and Russia, in Italy and Belgium, in the Philippines and Burma, on tropical islands whose names most of them couldn't pronounce. They dug in heat and cold, in rain and snow, in sand and clay, in volcanic rock and frozen tundra. They dug until their hands bled, until their backs screamed, until their bodies simply refused to continue. And then they dug more, because dawn was coming, and with dawn would come the enemy, and the only protection was earth. The shovel never received a monument, but across Europe and Asia and the Pacific Islands, across Russia and North Africa, the earth itself bears witness. The trenches and foxholes, the bunkers and tunnels, the anti-tank ditches and gun emplacements, these remain. They are slowly eroding, gradually softening back into the landscape, but they persist. They testify to the scale of effort, the universality of experience, the essential truth that survival in modern war required not just courage but labor, not just skill at arms but skill at excavation. The men who wielded those shovels knew this truth in their bones, in their scarred hands, in their damaged backs. They knew that the shovel saved them when nothing else could. They knew that the ability to dig, to excavate, to fortify, to burrow into earth was as essential as breathing, and they carried that knowledge with them always. A hard-won understanding purchased with exhaustion and preserved through survival. Their war was not the war shown in films, or celebrated in histories. It was a war of earth and labor, of blisters and calluses, of foxholes dug and filled and dug again. It was a war fought with shovels as much as with guns, won by excavation as much as by firepower. And it was real, more real than any sanitized narrative could ever be. This is their testimony, that war is work, endless and exhausting, that survival is earned through preparation and sustained through discipline, that the most important weapon is often the simplest, that courage alone is insufficient without the wisdom to seek shelter and the strength to dig it, that glory is fine for posterity, but earth common, earth properly excavated is what keeps you alive to see tomorrow. They dug, they survived, and in doing so they revealed the war's most fundamental truth, that in the end, despite all the technology and strategy and valor, survival came down to the oldest defensive technique known to humanity: putting enough earth between yourself and danger. Everything else was commentary, but this was essential. The soldiers who fought World War II with shovels were not different from other soldiers. They were all soldiers, engaged in the universal activity that made combat survivable. They were the war itself, reduced to its purest form, human bodies, hostile Earth, and the tool that mediated between vulnerability and protection. Their story deserves to be told, not as a footnote but as a central narrative, because without them, without their labor, without their shovels, the war could not have been fought at all.